What if everything you know about medieval Europe is wrong? Because the truth isn't shining knights and fairy tale castles. It's forgotten invasions, collapsing empires, and brutal power struggles that shaped the modern world you live in today. When Rome fell, Europe didn't fade into darkness. It erupted into a fight for survival. New kingdoms rising, old worlds dying, and a new civilization forming from the chaos. In the next few minutes, you'll uncover the turning points most history books skip, the moments that reshaped Europe and quietly shaped your world. The story of medieval Europe begins long before knights in armor rode into battle. It begins with the slow forging of an entirely new civilization, one built from shattered empires, wandering tribes, and a faith that would redefine the continent. During the first 2 centuries of the Common Era, the Roman Empire wrapped itself around the Mediterranean like an iron ring. Under the Pax Romana, people enjoyed stability, vast trade routes, and a level of urban life unmatched for centuries. Roads stretched across continents, aqueducts fed cities, and a centralized government kept order. But deep on Rome's eastern frontier, something quietly took root, a small religious movement that would one day challenge emperors: Christianity. At first, it was nothing more than a persecuted Jewish sect, yet slowly it spread across the empire, whisper by whisper, convert by convert. By the 4th century, Christianity had become Rome's official faith. But ironically, at the very moment the empire embraced this new religion, its foundations began to crack. What caused Rome's downfall might surprise you, and it wasn't just barbarians at the gates. Inflation surged, plagues ravaged cities, farms failed, armies rebelled. The empire had become too vast for a single capital to manage. And so, in 395 CE, Rome split east and west, a choice that would shape the next 1,000 years. When the Roman Empire split, the difference between its two halves was stark. The east, ruled from Constantinople, remained rich, urban, and tightly governed. The west, however, was crumbling, rural, poor, underdefended. And waiting in the shadows were the people Romans feared most. Across the forests beyond the Rhine and the Danube, tribal confederations were on the move. Goths, Vandals, Franks, Saxons, labels the Romans lumped together under one dismissive word: barbarians. But here's the twist. These weren't mindless hordes burning everything in their path. They were migrants, refugees, entire communities fleeing wars, hunger, and pressure from even fiercer powers further east. Yet Rome, desperate and overstretched, began letting them in. Why would an empire known for its discipline open the gates to armed tribes? Because it had no choice. As Roman authority weakened, these groups pushed deeper into imperial territory. Some arrived as allies, others as invaders, but all of them began carving out lands for themselves. Then, in 476 CE, the moment that textbooks love and historians debate, a Germanic leader named Odoacer quietly removed the boy emperor Romulus Augustulus. No battles, no grand collapse, just a final acknowledgement that Rome was a shadow of its former self. The Western Roman Empire was gone. What followed wasn't a sudden plunge into darkness, but a messy fusion. Romans, Christians, and these newly arrived tribal peoples blended their cultures, laws, and beliefs. Out of this chaotic mix, the first medieval kingdoms emerged: Ostrogoths in Italy, Visigoths in Spain, and the Franks in Gaul. But these kingdoms had a fatal flaw, a flaw that would almost doom Western Europe entirely. The new kingdoms that covered Western Europe around 500 CE were ambitious, but deeply fragile. Imagine inheriting the ruins of a vast civilization, but without the tools that made it work. That's exactly what these early medieval kings faced. The great Roman cities, shrinking, abandoned, or lying in rubble. The intricate road networks and trade routes, broken, overgrown, unusable coins. So rare they nearly vanished, dragging the economy back into barter. Literacy and administration collapsed to the point where many rulers could barely read their own decrees. So how do you govern a kingdom when you can't even pay an army or send messages across your own territory? The answer was simple: not very well. Europe became hyperlocal, fragmented. Communities spoke different dialects, followed different customs, and were isolated from one another. Compared to the prosperous Byzantine Empire in the east, or the rising powers of the Islamic world, the West seemed weak and unprepared. And things were about to get even more complicated. In the 6th century, Emperor Justinian I of Byzantium attempted to restore Rome to its former glory. He launched massive campaigns to reconquer Italy and reclaim the Western Mediterranean. For a brief moment, it looked like the Roman world might reunite, but the victory was short-lived. Before the Byzantines could consolidate control, new invaders, the Lombards, swept into Italy, shattering Justinian's dream. And while the East struggled to hold its gains, an even bigger earthquake was about to shake the map. Imagine a force so fast, so unexpected, that it reshaped entire continents in a single century. That force was coming from the south, and no one in Europe was ready. In the 7th century, something extraordinary happened, so extraordinary that even the strongest empires struggled to comprehend it. From the Arabian Peninsula, newly unified Arab armies surged outward with astonishing speed. Within a few decades, they conquered the Middle East, swept across North Africa, and forged an immense Islamic caliphate stretching from Persia to the Atlantic. One civilization had become three: Islamic, Byzantine, and medieval European. And suddenly, the fragile kingdoms of the West weren't just backwater states. They were neighbors to one of the fastest-growing empires in history. And then came the moment Europe almost didn't survive. What if one battle had gone differently? In the early 700s, Muslim forces crossed into the Iberian Peninsula, crushing the Visigothic kingdom in Spain. With remarkable momentum, they pushed north into Gaul, modern-day France, raiding deeper each year. European rulers watched in fear. Their kingdoms were divided, militarily weak, and lacking the unity to respond. But in 732, everything changed. At the Battle of Tours, a Frankish commander named Charles Martel, the Hammer, led his warriors against the advancing Muslim army. The Franks won, and with that victory, Islamic expansion into Western Europe was halted. It wasn't just a battle, it was a turning point, a moment where the West glimpsed its own collapse and then pulled back from the brink. And Charles Martel, his triumph didn't just save his kingdom, it launched a dynasty that would build the first great medieval empire, a dynasty that would crown a new Roman emperor, a dynasty led by a man whose name still echoes through history. After the Battle of Tours, the Franks were no longer just another barbarian kingdom. They were the defenders of Western Christendom, and their rising power centered around one family, the Carolingians. Charles Martel's son, Pepin the Short, took the next bold step. He deposed the last Merovingian king and seized the Frankish throne. This wasn't just a political move, it was a statement. The Carolingians were here to rule. Pepin forged an alliance with the Pope, fighting the Lombards in Italy and granting the papacy its own territories, the seeds of the Papal States. This bond between kings and popes would shape Europe for centuries. But Pepin's legacy was overshadowed by his son, a man whose ambition, intellect, and sheer force of will would reshape the medieval world. Charlemagne. Ascending the throne in 768, Charlemagne embarked on a relentless series of military campaigns. Year after year, he expanded Frankish control over Saxons, Avars, Lombards, and beyond, until he ruled more territory than any Western leader since ancient Rome. Here's the shocking part. Charlemagne didn't just conquer land. He attempted something far harder, rebuilding civilization itself. He gathered scholars, revived learning, standardized writing, supported monasteries, and kick-started what historians call the Carolingian Renaissance, a revival of knowledge long thought lost. And then came his moment of ultimate prestige. On Christmas Day, 800 CE, Pope Leo III placed a crown on Charlemagne's head and declared him Emperor of the Romans. More than 300 years after Rome fell, the West had an emperor again. But Charlemagne's empire, magnificent as it was, rested on shaky foundations, weak cities, fragile infrastructure, and an economy still crawling out of collapse. And when Charlemagne died, those cracks widened fast. Charlemagne built the greatest empire the West had seen in centuries, but it was an empire held together by one man's strength, reputation, and relentless will. And when he died in 814, the structure he created began to fracture. His heirs struggled to maintain unity. Communication was slow, cities were small and weak, the economy couldn't support a large bureaucracy or a standing army. So what happens when a massive empire has no strong roads, no modern administration, and no stable leadership? Simple, it tears itself apart. By 843, Charlemagne's grandsons settled their rivalries in the Treaty of Verdun, slicing the empire into three pieces: West Francia, East Francia, and a fragile middle kingdom that quickly dissolved. Europe was once again splintering, but the timing couldn't have been worse, because just as internal unity collapsed, danger arrived from every direction. From the north, Viking longships cut through rivers and coastlines, raiding towns, monasteries, and trade hubs with terrifying speed. From the east, the mounted warriors we know as Magyars, the early Hungarians, stormed across the plains, striking deep into German and Italian lands. And from the south, Muslim raiders attacked Europe's Mediterranean shores, seizing towns and disrupting trade routes. It was a three-front crisis the likes of which Europe had never faced. Kings watched their authority crumble as they failed to protect their people. In their place, local nobles, those with fortified strongholds, rose to power, and a new social order began to form, one built not on imperial law, but on personal alliances, loyalty, and land. This system would define medieval Europe for centuries. As Viking ships prowled the coasts, Magyars thundered across the plains, and raiders struck from the Mediterranean, Europe found itself trapped in a relentless storm. Kings, already weakened by the collapse of Charlemagne's empire, were powerless to defend their lands. So people turned to those who could protect them, local nobles. These nobles lived in castles, which were less the romantic stone fortresses we imagine today, and more rugged wooden strongholds designed to shield a small region. From these fortified homes, they ruled the surrounding countryside with absolute authority. This shift didn't just change politics, it rewired medieval society from the ground up. To survive, kings granted land to influential lords in exchange for loyalty and military service. Those lords, in turn, granted portions of their land to lesser nobles. This web of mutual protection and obligation formed what we now call feudalism. But there's something most people get wrong about feudalism. It wasn't a single, organized system. It was chaos held together by personal promises. In this world, a lord offered land, a vassal pledged loyalty and military service. Peasants worked the land in return for protection. And as warfare evolved, with the stirrup making heavy cavalry deadly, the nobility became a full-time military class. Knights weren't just soldiers, they were the elite rulers of medieval society. Meanwhile, kings were often overshadowed by powerful vassals who controlled more troops, more money, and more castles than the monarchs themselves. Europe had become a patchwork of semi-independent territories, each ruled by men whose power came from land, swords, and personal loyalties, not national institutions. But just when this fragmented world seemed permanent, everything changed again. Because around the 10th century, Europe experienced a transformation that no one saw coming. After centuries of invasions, famine, and fragmentation, Europe finally caught its breath. Around the 10th century, a quiet transformation began, one that would reshape the map once again. The climate warmed, harvests improved, and the great waves of external attacks slowly faded. The Vikings settled in the lands they once raided. The Hungarians converted to Christianity and formed a kingdom of their own. Muslim raiders retreated as new powers rose in the Mediterranean. For the first time in generations, Europeans could do something remarkable. They could plan for the future, and with stability came renewal. In Britain, King Alfred the Great and his successors united the scattered Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, forging the first true kingdom of England. A centralized monarchy began to take shape, one far more orderly than most of the continent. Across the Channel in West Francia, Viking settlers were granted land in exchange for loyalty. These fierce warriors became Christian nobles known as the Normans, and they were about to play a much bigger role in European history. In East Francia, a determined ruler named Otto I defeated the Hungarians at the Battle of Lechfeld in 955, ending the last wave of invasions. His victory restored confidence and won him a crown. In 962, Otto was declared emperor, reviving the Roman imperial title once again. This empire, later called the Holy Roman Empire, would dominate Central Europe for centuries. Europe, after generations of chaos, was stabilizing. Populations grew, fields expanded, and small towns began turning into bustling centers of trade. But this renewal was only the beginning. A far greater transformation was coming, one that would fill Europe with new cities, new ideas, and new ambitions. Around the year 1000, Europe entered a period so dramatic that historians call it the medieval Golden Age, 3 centuries of growth, expansion, and transformation. And it all began with something surprisingly simple: food. A warmer climate and new farming technologies, like the heavy plow, the 3-field system, and better harnesses for horses, triggered an agricultural revolution. Fields yielded more, harvests became more reliable, and Europe finally produced more food than it consumed. It's strange to think about, but this agricultural shift did more to change medieval life than any king or knight ever did. With more food came more people. With more people came new villages and expanded towns. Forests were cleared, rivers tamed, and Europe's landscape reshaped by human hands. As populations swelled, trade networks reawakened. Merchants traveled across the continent, linking distant regions together. Markets grew into towns, towns grew into cities. A new class emerged: free citizens and merchants, who didn't belong to the old feudal hierarchy. In Italy, port cities like Venice and Genoa revived the Mediterranean trade routes, becoming wealthy, independent powerhouses. With prosperity came curiosity. Cathedrals, monasteries, and royal courts supported scholars who began copying ancient texts and teaching new ideas. The first universities were born: Paris, Bologna, Oxford, centers where theology, law, and philosophy flourished. And while Europe looked inward to rebuild itself, its knights and nobles were also preparing to look outward again, far beyond their borders, because soon the energies of this booming civilization would explode into new territories. And one of the most dramatic conquests in medieval history was about to reshape England forever. By the 11th century, Europe was no longer a backwater of scattered fiefs. It had grown stronger, wealthier, and hungrier for expansion. One of the most dramatic events of this era was the Norman conquest of England in 1066. Led by William the Conqueror, Duke of Normandy, the Normans defeated the Anglo-Saxons at the Battle of Hastings, forever altering the political, social, and cultural fabric of England. This wasn't just a battle. It was a blueprint for how military power, organization, and ambition could reshape an entire kingdom overnight. Meanwhile, across Europe, Christian kingdoms in Iberia began their centuries-long reconquista, pushing Muslim rulers southward and reclaiming territory in Spain and Portugal. In southern Italy and Sicily, Norman adventurers conquered Byzantine and Muslim lands, securing powerful positions while allying with the papacy. In the east, German nobles and peasants migrated into Slavic lands, clearing forests and establishing settlements. The boundaries of Western Christendom expanded, creating a more unified cultural and religious landscape. And yet, Europe's eyes were not just turning inward or eastward. They were reaching far beyond the continent. In 1095, Pope Urban II issued a call to arms that would launch the First Crusade. Knights and nobles swarmed eastward to reclaim Jerusalem and other holy sites, establishing short-lived Christian states on the shores of the Mediterranean. Though these crusader states would eventually fall, their creation signaled a dramatic shift. The Catholic Church had awakened as a central power, and Europe was no longer isolated. It was a player on a global stage. By this point, the stage was set. A continent recovering from chaos, united by faith and trade, yet still fractured by feudal loyalties and military ambitions. Europe was entering its high Middle Ages, ready for cultural, technological, and political revolutions. By the 10th and 11th centuries, the Catholic Church was no longer a simple network of priests and local monasteries. It had begun a dramatic transformation into a centralized, hierarchical power, with the Pope at its apex. But this wasn't easy. Kings, nobles, and even emperors weren't going to surrender authority without a fight. reformers demanded the church be freed from secular influence. Pope Gregory VII became the face of this movement, insisting that only the Pope could appoint bishops and enforce ecclesiastical law. The confrontation reached its peak with the investiture controversy. The Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV refused to comply. In one of history's most dramatic spectacles, he spent 3 days standing barefoot in the snow at Canossa, begging for the Pope's forgiveness. Yet even as monarchs resisted, the Church emerged stronger. By the 12th century, it had a robust legal system, vast wealth, and unprecedented influence across Europe. Meanwhile, monarchs studied the Church's example. The same century saw kings consolidating power over feudal lords. Castles evolved, wood gave way to stone, designs grew larger and more defensible, and knights became symbols of both military prowess and aristocratic culture. And just when you think Europe might finally settle down, technological and military revolutions were on the horizon. Gunpowder, siege engines, and more disciplined infantry armies would soon make the armored knight vulnerable, and castles were no longer impregnable. Kings seized this opportunity to centralize authority further. Nobles lost military dominance, often becoming administrators or courtiers under monarchs' control. From this struggle emerged the foundations of the modern sovereign state. By the end of the High Middle Ages, Europe had grown stronger, wealthier, and more organized. Yet the continent was about to face one of its most devastating catastrophes, the Black Death. By the early 14th century, Europe had grown powerful, prosperous, and confident, but nature had other plans. In 1347, a mysterious plague arrived on European shores, the Black Death. Within a few short years, it killed roughly 1/3 of the continent's population. Cities emptied, villages vanished, and entire trade networks collapsed. How could a single disease wield more power than kings, knights, and empires combined? The effects were immediate and terrifying. Fields went untended, food shortages intensified, labor became scarce, sending wages soaring. Peasants and workers suddenly found themselves in a position of unprecedented bargaining power. Some revolted when elites refused to improve conditions. Although many revolts were brutally crushed, the long-term effect was transformative. Feudal rigidity began to erode, and new opportunities for social mobility emerged. Out of the chaos, creativity and technology flourished. Windmills and watermills multiplied, eyeglasses improved literacy, and new techniques in metallurgy and printing began spreading. Urban centers, despite depopulation, recovered quickly and became hubs for new cultural trends. In Italy, a rebirth of classical learning, what we now call the Renaissance, took root, inspiring scholars to rethink humanity's place in the world and bridging the medieval past with the emerging modern age. And as Europe rebuilt itself, warfare was changing too. Gunpowder arrived from the east, forever altering the battlefield. Knights on horseback could be shot down from a distance. Even the strongest castles could be breached by cannon fire. Kings realized that to maintain authority, they had to monopolize military power, centralize control, and assert dominance over the aristocracy. By the late 15th century, Europe had transformed yet again, a continent recovering from catastrophe, harnessing innovation, and ready to step onto the global stage. By the 15th century, Europe had recovered from the Black Death, but political rivalries and territorial ambitions were reaching new heights. One of the most significant conflicts of this era was the 100 Years' War between England and France. Stretching from 1337 to 1453, it was not just a struggle for land, it was a battle for the identity and future of nations. And then came an unexpected figure who would change the course of history forever. A young peasant girl named Joan of Arc. Claiming divine guidance, Joan rallied the French army and inspired them to lift the siege of Orleans. Her leadership reversed France's fortunes, boosting morale and turning the tide against the English. Though she was eventually captured and executed, her courage and vision helped solidify French national identity. Meanwhile, beyond the battlefield, monarchs were centralizing power. In England, the Anglo-Norman dynasty consolidated authority, creating a more unified state. In Spain, The marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile unified their kingdoms, culminating in the conquest of Granada, the last Muslim stronghold on the Iberian Peninsula. In France, the Capetian kings gradually expanded their domains, slowly building a functioning state. Elsewhere, regions like Germany and Italy remained fragmented, composed of semi-autonomous principalities that would take centuries to unify. Europe was no longer just surviving, it was evolving. A continent that once relied on feudal lords, fragmented kingdoms, and local fortresses was beginning to give rise to centralized states, capable of projecting power both internally and across borders. And as Europe emerged from medieval turbulence, its attention began shifting outward, to distant lands, oceans, and the unknown worlds beyond. By the late 15th century, Europe had not only recovered from centuries of turmoil, but had also built the foundations for a global transformation. The kingdoms of Portugal and Spain led the charge. Portuguese explorers sailed down the coast of Africa and across the Indian Ocean, establishing new trade routes to the east. Meanwhile, Spain turned westward, crossing the Atlantic. In 1492, Christopher Columbus reached the Americas, opening the door to European colonization, trade, and cultural exchange on an unprecedented scale. Can you imagine a continent that once barely survived invasions now controlling oceans and connecting the world? Europe's expansion was more than geography. It was economic, political, and cultural. Wealth from new lands fueled the growth of cities, trade networks, and kingdoms. Monarchs grew stronger, universities expanded knowledge, and the Renaissance flourished, bridging the medieval world with new ideas, science, and art. The Middle Ages weren't just a period of darkness or decay, they were a time of transformation. From the fall of Rome, kingdoms rose and fell. Barbarian migrations reshaped Europe's demographics. Feudalism structured society, while monarchs and the church consolidated power. Crises like the Black Death led to social change and technological innovation. By 1500, Europe had emerged as a continent ready to influence the globe. Its internal struggles had forged resilient kingdoms, innovative societies, and a dynamic culture. The medieval centuries had quietly set the stage for the modern world we recognize today. From shattered cities and barbarian invasions to voyages across oceans, the story of medieval Europe is not one of stagnation. It's the story of rebirth, resilience, and the relentless shaping of history itself. So, what have we learned from 1,000 years of medieval Europe? It wasn't a simple story of knights, castles, or fairy tale heroes. It was a story of collapse and rebirth, struggle and innovation, of people responding to crises and shaping the world for generations to come. From the ashes of Rome, new kingdoms arose, blending Roman traditions with the cultures of migrating peoples. The Carolingians tried to revive empire, and Charlemagne's reign showed that leadership, vision, and knowledge could reshape a continent. Yet even his empire crumbled under the weight of geography, politics, and succession disputes. Feudalism emerged as a practical solution to insecurity, while local lords ruled the land and peasants labored under new systems of loyalty and obligation. The High Middle Ages brought stability, agricultural innovation, and urban growth. Trade networks flourished, universities emerged, and European society became increasingly literate and connected. Wars like the 100 Years' War tested nations, while heroes like Joan of Arc inspired unity and identity. The Black Death, though catastrophic, accelerated change. It shifted power toward laborers, prompted technological innovation, and sparked cultural renewal. By the late 15th century, Europe was politically stronger, intellectually richer, and socially more dynamic than ever before. And then came exploration. Europe looked beyond itself, crossing oceans, discovering new lands, and beginning the global expansion that would shape the modern world. What if we had ignored the so-called Dark Ages? The truth is, every collapse, every battle, every innovation of medieval Europe quietly forged the world we inhabit today. From fragmented kingdoms to powerful states, from rural villages to bustling cities, the medieval story is the blueprint of resilience, transformation, and human ambition. Medieval Europe wasn't the end of civilization. It was the beginning of the modern age.